Hi, this is Bob Sorrentino from Italian Roots and Genealogy, and I'm here today with Tilda Virgilio, and we're going to talk about how she got started with her research and her family. So welcome, Tilda. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
I always like to start these things by asking people, what got you started and how long have you been doing this?
Well, because we came to America, I'm an immigrant myself, and when I came in 1954, we got on the boat, we Conte Biancamano, with only 2 suitcases, $200, 2 trunks, 2 kids, and my mother. That's it. So we left everything behind. When that happens, you kind of get attached to the memories. And as a result, I've hung on since I was 6 years old, which is when I arrived, to all the memories that I had to leave behind. So it kept me company, remembering everything that happened in Italy while I was adapting to whatever was going on here in the States.
Oh, so I didn't realize that you immigrated to the U.S. yourself.
Yes,
Oh,
yes.
so I think you're the first person that I've
Really?
interviewed, other than some of my cousins
Ah,
that immigrated, and they came. Well, they went to Canada first, but probably got to America just around the same time as you did.
really? 1954 on a ship, probably, because in those days, that's how it was.
Well, they had to take a ship to. They went to Canada first because
Right,
they couldn't come directly in.
right.
And my uncle had come a few years earlier, and he was working on a mushroom farm near Toronto.
Uh, oh,
Uh,
okay.
but they were all, I think at the time, my youngest cousin was probably, I'm going to say, well, I bet he's probably just around your age. Yeah, I think he was probably born around 48 or 49,
I was
something
born
like that.
48, January 48. My brother was 2 years older than me, my brother Michael. And he's doing the genealogy part, which is very statistical, the data, the documents, the downloading of information from overseas. He's really into the tree. I'm more into the stories.
Yeah, and that's cool. Um, so what brought your mom to come here? I mean,
Well,
I'm assuming there was family.
my mother, no, my mother was born in the Bronx.
Oh,
And she went to Italy when she was 6 because my uncle, her brother, her older brother, had problems with his lungs. And at that time in the Bronx, it was pretty congested like it is today. My grandparents had a choice: go to California, where the weather was better for him, or back to Italy. So my grandmother took the 2 children, went to Italy. My grandfather stayed and was working at the subway system as a conductor. So he stayed in the States until he retired, and then went to Italy when he retired. Meanwhile, a lot went on, but my mother was already a citizen. Even though during the war there was questions and she had to state her passport, she was a citizen. So she came to America on her own without anybody calling her in. So we had family, but nobody spoke Italian and we didn't speak English. So it took us a while to learn.
oh, that's a really interesting story.
Yeah.
That kind of come the reverse way. So now, what did your mom do when she got here?
Well, when
How
we
did she
came to
work?
America, because she couldn't speak any English and we were trying, but it's a rough language to learn. She worked in the factories in the garment district, and we lived in Hell's Kitchen. So we lived in a cold water flat, $13 a month rent with no heat. We had no hot water, and we shared a bathroom with 4 other families. It was in the hallway. It's an
Mhm.
old-fashioned tenement. And when
Yeah.
I go to the museum that they have in the city, it's like going home. It's exactly how we lived, at the tub in the kitchen. It's very rustic. But because we're living in Italy, in the city during the winter school days, and then in the summer we would go to the country. So in the country we had a little cottage with no heat, no electricity, no nothing, just a fire. And so roughing it wasn't really a big deal. We were kind of used to it. But it's easier to rough it in the country than it is to rough it in the city. That I
Yeah, I
recall.
bet. I bet. Uh, so, um, so yeah. Again, when my mother's family first came, they lived in Hell's Kitchen too, but they were Barres, so they were Icemen.
I'm
Um,
Barres. I'm
how are
Barres.
you? So from
I was
where?
born in Bari. Bari.
Body itself.
My whole family came from Castellana, which is a little tiny village nearby, Castellana Grotte, but generations of them. But they went to Bari, which is where the family still is. I have a lot of relatives still in Bari, and I was born in Bari, Via do Verdò 16, which is still there. It's a
Oh,
house
wow.
it survived the war. It was so well built. My grandfather built it. He sent the money to build it. From here, he sent the money there. They built this house, and that's the house I was born in.
Oh, that's neat. So, yeah, my mom's family they're from Torito.
Ah, well,
And
Pellegrino. We're Pellegrino and Virgilio.
oh, I'm gonna have to check and see if we have any. Have any? I don't think Pellegrino. There may be a Virgilio floating around out there
Virgilio is
someplace.
very common from Bitrito, which is in Puglia, but Virgilio is a common name, relatively common. Pellegrino is even more common in Castellana. The whole town is a Pellegrino town because we were there
Oh,
for
yeah.
hundreds of years. So,
Uh,
yeah.
yeah, and they were there. I guess both my grandmother's, oh, my mother's family was there for a couple of decades, I guess. But originally, my grandfather's family was from Acquaviva dell'Infante.
Oh, I know Acquaviva. Yes. I think I actually went there once when I was a kid.
Really?
Well, yes. Well, we came to the States because my father had tuberculosis from the war. He caught it in World War II. So my mother couldn't stay in Italy because she would have to live under the roof of his mother. And that wasn't going to happen. So she got tickets as best as she could. It took her years to get the visas to come to the States. And my father went in a sanatorium. So when we said goodbye in 1954, we never thought we'd see him again. Because in those days, tuberculosis, that was it. And it was highly contagious. So you became a pariah in the town. And so rather than have to deal with that drama, we just left.
So how much of Italy do you actually remember?
A lot, a lot. A lot because it was a drastic change from the time I was 2. We moved from Bari to Foggia, and then I lived in Foggia. And then when my father had to go to the sanatorium, we became homeless. So I had to go we lived in a war shelter, in a bomb shelter, my brother and I. Then we went to Castellana. So we were all over the place that last year. So I remember all these changes, which embedded in my memory different experiences. And it was a drastic change. We'd sell all our furniture. I remember a lot. And I studied Italian in high school when I came to the States to keep the language. So I'm fluent in Italian and I translate as well. So I even write in Italian. I write in Italian poetry, and I do the math in Italian because I never unlearned it. So, yeah.
That's funny. So now you say you're mostly interested in this in the story. So what stories do you have that?
Oh my goodness. I've been keeping a legacy project going for almost 2 years now since I've been home. I grabbed all the photo albums and I started sorting through them. And as I did this, stories came back. So these stories that I'm saving are the story of the family when we came to America, the story of the family before we came to America, the story of my grandmother that I never met, my grandfather that I never met, and my father's parents I knew, and I have those stories. So all the memories and all the stories, because I was the keeper of the elderly. I took care of my mom, I took care of my dad, and they told me all these stories. Nobody was around, so I wrote them down. So now I have all these notes that I've taken that I'm going to transpose into actual stories. I've been doing it for almost 2 years now.
So what did what did your grandparents do in Italy? What were they
Well, my father's parents, the Virgilios, were tradesmen. They were they sold and purchased merchandise, import export kind of thing. My mother's father and mother, she was a seamstress, my grandmother Rosa, and my grandfather. Now, when he first went to America, he was about 10 years old, and he came to America with 4 other Italian boys, 2 of which were his brothers, but they all pretended to be family, so it would be easier to get a place, to come over, so they all came under the same name on the manifest. He came to America, I think he went to Boston, and he used to be the cook, to clean the bottle washer, because he was the youngest. And he was like a wife, and everybody else went to work and they did various things. He became a mason in trade and went cross country when he became a young man. He went from New York, from Chicago, Boston, New York, and then across the country working on the railroad. And then he became also as a mason, wherever he could get jobs. And then he went to the Alaska Gold Rush because that was the big deal in those days. And he wanted to buy land. Meanwhile, he went back to Italy every year and he fell in love with my grandmother, and she was 16. But he said, "You're going to marry me. I know you're engaged to this guy, but you're going to marry me." He decided he was going to make a fortune, and that way he could be qualified to marry a beautiful woman. And he wanted to bring her to the States. So he hit it big in Alaska. And he told his partner, "Okay, I'm going to go get my wife. We're going to buy a house, blah, blah, blah." He goes to Italy to get his wife. He gets married. He comes to the States with her, and his partner absconded with everything. So now my grandfather's left with his wife, newlywed, and no money.
So that's an amazing story. But I think a lot of that went on with partners absconding. Whether it was Italians or other people.
We'll be right back.
Experience Italy like never before, traveling with a scheduled group or create your own bespoke tour with friends with philitaly.com. Pack your bags and follow Phil. That's www.philitaly.co.
So they moved to New York, they moved to the Bronx, and that's where they settled down at Brownstone. And my grandmother worked in a factory as a seamstress, and he worked in the subways. And that's where he stayed, and that's where she stayed until my uncle and my mom were born. And then they went back to Italy. Just the way my mother had to split up the family, my grandmother had to do the same thing. So
that's tough. Yeah, that's got to be hard. It's certainly not like today where you have telephones and Wi-Fi and all that.
No, but they wrote a lot to each other. I wish they saved the letters, because that would have meant so much to me to have their letters. But because they wrote a lot to each other, and he wrote to the children. My grandfather, Giuseppe Pellegrino, was a tall man, very muscular. For an Italian guy, you look at the pictures. I sent a picture of him working in Washington State as a rail splitter. So there's a very old picture with a catapult on it. And that picture was from when he was working cross country.
Yeah, that's a really great story. And you often think about what were in people's minds, when they decided to do these kinds of things, and to be that adventurous. So that was, I guess, the early 1900s when he was doing this?
Yes, I believe it probably was. Sure. Because my mom was born in 1917. And so it had to be. Yeah. Yeah. And so they came to Italy. They went to Italy. They went to Castellana, which is my favorite little town. I'm in there. And my favorite relatives live there. And it's a very small little town, very medieval. It didn't have any cars. It didn't have refrigeration. People lived in little houses like Yoda, little tiny cave-like houses. But I stayed with my aunt there when I was 6, and she had a bridal shop. She was the town healer. She used to dispense some herbs and spices. And I just fell in love with the simplicity of her life. And it kept me going during the complicated years of being an immigrant, especially when I couldn't speak the language. Those first 2 or 3 years were really difficult.
I bet they were.
It was freezing cold. I wasn't used to the cold. I mean, Bari has coconut trees, and it's never cold. The winters you wear a sweater. Here we came with the snowdrifts 8 feet high, no heat, no hot water. Oh my God, those first couple of winters, we slept with all our clothes on and everything we owned on the bed. Yeah.
And I have, my cousin, he interviewed my uncle before he passed away. He passed away, probably 25 years now, I guess. But he interviewed him in Bari and had a tape recorded.
Oh.
And he never translated it. And when I got wind of it, I said, Joey, you have to translate this for the family, because my uncle was born in 1906, I think. 1906 or 1909. 06, must have been 06, because my mother was born in 25 and he was a lot older. And it's just a fascinating history of life in Torito from, 1909 until he left in 1949, I think he left. And, through the war years and the bombings and what they ate and all of that kind of stuff. And he was lucky because when World War II broke out, he already had, I think, probably 3 children, and he had been in the Army before, so he didn't have to go into the Army.
He had already served, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, my father was a captain. My father was a captain in the Italian Army. And they had gone to Albania, I believe. And my grandfather was in World War One, and he used to show me his bullet wound in his leg. He told me all about trench warfare, and told me all the war stories, because I love my grandfather. My father's father, he was a sweetheart. And my father got tuberculosis because of the conditions of the war. However, the war stories he said were not typical war stories, because they were there kind of isolated for a long, long time. They saw action, but he had a really good relationship with his crew. And he used to build a presepio. I don't know if you know what that is.
No.
Presepio. I sent you a picture of the most recent picture that I have of my father building the presepio. St. Francis of Assisi used to have a live nativity creche at Christmas. And in Italy, especially in the South, there's a tradition of every Christmas. We didn't have Christmas trees, but we built a presepio, which is the nativity scene of Christ's birth, but it's the whole town of Bethlehem. Mountains, waterfall, the whole bit. My father's, the tradition in our family is over 8, 9 generations. We have statues that have been handed down each generation to generation. So we built a presepio with statues that my great-great-grandfather used. And so if we add to it, because they don't last too long, because they made of clay. But my brother now, my younger brother, Joseph, who was born in 1962, and my father came to America, he has the presepio, and he's doing it with his son. So it carries on. I've also taken part of it, and I make it for my daughters and my grandchildren. So the tradition that we have not been able to pass on of dinner at the table every Sunday, stories at the table every Sunday, but at Christmas, we get together and we make the presepio. It's a tradition, and we keep it. So it's nice that it's the one thing we kept.
Wow, that's, yeah, I never heard of that. Now, is that a, I'm gonna have to ask one of my cousins, is that a Barese thing, a Puglia thing?
No,
or
it's an Italian thing.
It's just an
It's
Italian thing. Yeah.
All Italy does. And what they do is every area does the presepio, which is a nativity creche. You can think of a railroad, those railroad scenes where they put little tiny railroad. That's the idea, only it's with the town of Bethlehem at the time of Christ's birth. So we duplicate the unleavened bread, the oil bottles with the little tiny Hebrew writing. I mean, it's very historically accurate, and everybody does it different. From the South, so my presepio looks Southern. The people from the North, they put snow, they do it their way. So every region, if you're in a city, they tend to make it more building structure-like. So everybody does it. It's a folk art, but it's become extremely refined.
I think I've seen something like that, but I didn't recognize it as the presepio, but I think I have seen photos. Yeah.
Yeah, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, when they have their Christmas tree, underneath it, they have a presepio. It's freeform, but doesn't have a lot of construction, but it's basically the same idea. And St. Francis of Assisi did the first one. And my father, during World War II, during Christmas, knew that his men were missing being home. So he and a couple of his lieutenants would build it in a cave. They would have candles, and they would reconstruct as best as they could. He had all the statues sent to him from my grandfather, and he built it. And at Christmas Eve, which is when you have the ceremony, he gave candles to all the soldiers, and they all went and did the procession, which is what you do. You sing this particular song, Tu scendi dalle stelle, and Christmas Eve begins Christmas. That's how Christmas is done in Italy, Christmas Eve. So he with his soldiers, and it's the same statues that we now use. So I've actually contributed this, and I have a whole write-up of military history. A friend of mine is a historian, and he wanted an accountability of this because it's important to him that he documents Italian soldiers in Italy during the war. So this story is part of his documentation.
We'll be right back.
Lafayette, we are here. The French history podcast for the American public by a Frenchman. Learn all about France's fascinating history, its great characters like Charlemagne, Joan of Arc, Louis XIV, or Napoleon, but also the great events that marked France, Europe, and sometimes the whole world. Lafayette, we're here. Available wherever you get your podcast or on LafayettePodcast.com. À bientôt.
Right. So now, obviously the Italian army was fighting for the Germans at some point, and then that stopped. So what happened, when the
Well,
Germans left?
there was more than one army. There was the Nationalist Army, and then there was those that were Mussolini followers, the black shirts. So my father was more with the Italian Nationalist Army. So when Hitler came down, of course, they were fighting against Hitler because Hitler came and took over everything. I mean, he lied to Mussolini, and by the time he came down to the South, we knew we had been rooked. And it was a while, and it was a pretty brutal battle. But fortunately, my father survived it, and a lot of his men did too, because they were up in the mountains. By the time it arrived in the mountains, the fighting was done. And then the Americans came. And when the Americans came, well, the troops came, and then the Americans came, it was over. So it was an interesting war, to say the least. And the Italians are not really fighters. So any opportunity to not engage was a good one. They all wanted to go home. That's what my father used to say.
Well, and I think one of the amazing things about it is that there were so many Italian Americans in the American army, that went to Italy, and some found families, some found brides, whatever. My uncle, he was blind in one eye, and when he took the eye test, they said switch. He read the eye chart with the same eye, and they told him he would never go overseas. But when they learned that he spoke fluent Italian, they sent him to North Africa to guard Italian prisoners. And so he said he used to eat with the Italian prisoners because they used to have spaghetti and sauce. He said, and we were eating out of cans.
Yeah, I used to be a home health aide, and I took care of a woman because I spoke Italian, who was Sicilian, and she told me amazing stories about when they were in Africa, that her husband had been kidnapped, the whole family had been kidnapped and brought to Africa, and because he was an engineer. So she told me all sorts of wonderful stories that I wrote down.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah,
fascinating stories. Yeah, she had nobody to tell them to, so I just sat there and played Scopa with her and just wrote everything down. Yeah.
I used to play Scopa with my grandmother, and I forgot how to play. I was trying to find it on the internet. I said, how could I have forgotten how to play this game?
They have it online. I looked it up because I forgot how to do it. I was teaching my grandson with the cards how to play war. There's a game that you can play, visual game, because they're all very picturesque, the Neapolitan cards.
Yeah.
And the ones you play Scopa with. So there's a game that you can play, and he loved it because he was like 3 years old, and I showed him how to do races with the horses. And now he's teaching his brother and younger sister how to do the same game. I love it. I love it because, you got to introduce them slowly to things.
Yeah. But yeah, I used to love sitting there with my grandmother playing Scopa. There was Scopa, and there was another game too.
Briscola.
Yes. So we used to sit. She taught me how to play. I think she taught us all how to play. And she spoke English, but very rough English. Very, very tough English. But that's why my mother's family came to America, because my grandfather, he had served in the Libyan War in like 1911. And when World War I broke out, my grandmother, supposedly, this is what I heard, she said, you're not going to war again. You have a family now. And they came to America, but left my uncle with his grandparents.
Oh yeah, that happened a lot.
And so when I think they had the intention of going back, but by the time my uncle came, he hadn't seen his parents in 35 years.
So he never met them.
No, I never met any of his brothers or sisters.
Wow.
Because they were all American. Yeah. And so all my cousins, from my Uncle John, were all born in Italy.
Well, my brother Joe, the younger one, was born in America because in 60, my father came. He had what they called, he was an experiment. They did surgery on him from the back. They opened up his back and took out the lung that had tuberculosis in it and calcified the other piece. So he lived till he was like 82 with a calcified quarter of a lung, and that's all he had. And he worked in import-export. My brother was born when he was 50. He buried every doctor that told him he was going to die.
That's too
He
funny.
told him you have only so much to live. He says, yeah.
So what was that? Because I have the description of my great grandparents' house that was became my uncle's house. But what was the house like in Italy?
Well, the house in Bari, the one my grandfather had built, he, again, American reputation of having a lot of money. So all the workmen who were dying to get jobs would say to him, okay, send us such and such, send us such and such. It was an apartment building, 8 floors. 4 floors my mother owned, 4 floors my uncle owned. It was a big building, one of the tallest buildings in Bari. And of course, because my grandfather sent trusting the invoices approved, these carpenters and masons just kept ordering supplies and kept building and building and building. They built it with 3 series of walls, one inside the other, so that they can keep on working. So during the war, the bombs were falling, and the only building that stood was that house. So when the Nazis came, they took over the house because they used it as their headquarters. When the Americans came, again, they took over that house because it became their headquarters. Meanwhile, in the walls, because it was 3 or 4, we had refugees hiding. Even when the Nazis were there, we had refugees in the building, on their way up north, on their way somewhere else, like the Underground Railroad, pretty much. Yeah, what a story. So that house, the house I was born in, was beautiful. It had a square courtyard closed in, all marble stairs. I mean, I got to tell you, my grandfather worked like a horse, and when he came to Bari, he saw the building and goes, holy cow. It's like a little castle, and it's still there. It's still there.
Wow, that's a great story.
It is.
That's unbelievable. When I talked to my cousin, they were never bombed because it's nothing. I guess there was nothing importance in Torito, but she said they would see it.
Yeah.
But my aunt would gather up all the kids and they'd run into the fields.
Yeah, well, that's yeah. Yeah, and the bomb shelter that I stayed in that year that my brother and I were homeless was in the mountains. It was definitely in the mountains, and it was a place that people had gone to. You could see there were wooden cots and stuff left behind from when people used to go and run to the mountains. Supplies, water. You couldn't drink it, but it was. You could see that it wasn't that long ago. I mean, I was born in '48, so I had friends in school in Italy that had lost limbs because of the grenades that were still, not the grenades, the mines that were still in the ground in the woods. And even though they used to try to rope off with yellow ribbon where you can't go in the woods, the soldiers had done that to try to warn us kids,
Yeah, right.
and I'd hear at least one every couple of months. Some kid lost a foot, lost a hand. It was terrible. I remember. So that was, already in 1950. So the war may have been gone, but it took a long, long time for the actual war to finish. And for the stories never ended. All the stories that I heard.
Yeah, that's that's kind of what my cousin said. In their case, they had just a little home, 2-room home with one room was my aunt and uncle's room, and my cousin said, and the newest baby, and she said there was always a baby, and then the other room was the fireplace, the kitchen, the kids' room,
Oh, that was
the
pretty
living room.
Yeah.
Everything else happened in the other room, but no plumbing, no anything.
Yeah. In the country, that's how we were in the country. It was roughing it, but it was when you're not like a winter in that kind of condition, it's not so bad. It's when you have to go through a winter, and you've got these conditions, these austere conditions, that you really can't get too much firewood. You're kind of stuck. It's rough. It's rough.
Yeah.
And food too, because that's the other thing. We had no refrigeration, and you really had to go to market every single day. And food was a constant preoccupation. You ate today, you don't know if you're going to eat tomorrow. And there was everything had been destroyed, the farmlands, so it was hard to reconstruct.
Yeah, I asked my cousin what did you eat? She said beans.
Yeah, there was very little. If you had a chicken, it was gold. To have an egg, it was a long time. I never had meat, as a matter of fact. I did not taste meat until I came to America. And I was 7
Really?
years old the first time I had a piece of meat.
Wow, so what was okay, so you never had meat before. This is intriguing. So what did you think of it when you first tasted meat?
The first bite I had was, of course, a piece of beefsteak. My uncle, a distant uncle, said, you have to try this. And I said, what is it? And he told me it was part of a cow. And I was like, I'm not going to eat a cow. You know? It was so good. Oh my God. The flavor was so rich. I had never tasted anything like it. It was just one bite, you know, and I'll never forget it. I was 7 years old, how good and it was a treat. It was a real treat. Of course, we didn't have any money, so it's not as if we were able to buy it. And even when we finally could, my mother didn't know how to cook it. She used to always cook it so much that, because she used to make afraid of the blood, so she would cook it till it was dark black. You couldn't chew it. Learning how to cook American food was a real adventure. Yeah.
Yeah. My mom's family was quite, even in America, and they used to play a game. I guess maybe they got one piece of meat each or something like that when they had meat. And if you turned your fork a certain way, your brother or your sister, you could steal your food. So they used to. And my aunt told me, they used to get for Christmas, if they got an orange for Christmas,
Oh yeah,
that was a big
Christmas.
deal.
Yeah, our Christmases, we used to get the top half of the tree from my neighbor's throwaway. She used to have a big tree, my neighbor, Pasquarella. So they used to cut the top because it didn't fit. And we get the top, and that was our tree. Of course, we had no decorations, so we used to make, foil, gum wrappers, whatever we could find. We used to decorate the tree with that,
Oh, wow.
egg. When we found eggshells in the garbage, we would decorate the egg and hang it up on the tree. Our tree was somebody else's garbage, but it was a tree. We didn't have trees in Italy. That wasn't the ceremony. The big thing for us was the presepio. We could just put the crush, Jesus, Mary, Joseph, and the cow and the donkey. That's it. That was all we could do. So we missed that. And when my father came to America, he brought everything with him. So.
Well, growing up, my aunt used to have a tree, and her presepio was the manger, and there'd be maybe 2 Josephs, 3 Marys, all kinds of different animals, and usually some guy skiing through the middle of everything.
The extended family. Well, I saw the villages. People used to build these snow villages with cotton and snow. And I kept looking for Jesus, my exposure to the American Christmas. And I went, where's Jesus? There's no Jesus. I said, why not? Yeah. And the first Thanksgiving, because we arrived in November. As a matter of fact, our ship, November was a very bad storm that year. And our ship got thrown off course and landed in Halifax. We had 2 dead bodies on board because our cabin was 45 people altogether. And people died, and they didn't tell anybody because they were afraid they'd send us back. So they kept quiet, and these 2 people had heart attacks. So we had 2 corpses in the ship with us. We couldn't open up the portals because it was November and we were below water, right above the engine room. And everybody was seasick, everybody. So my brother and I were the only 2 kids that were adventurous enough to go steal bread from the upper deck. I used to steal bread from the upper deck because there was no food down there. Everybody was sick. I'll never forget the voyage over. I mean, it was really rough, really, really rough. We wound up in Canada, and then we wound up coming from Halifax, where they took the 2 bodies, and then we came to New York, and it took forever to let us process. It was in the pier. We didn't go to Ellis Island because they stopped doing Ellis Island for people, a while back. But it took forever to process us. I'll never forget. I was at the pier. Virgilio, alphabetically. By the time they got to us, it was like, yeah. And our uncle was waiting. My mother's distant cousin was waiting to bring us to Babylon. And we stayed in his attic, but had no heat. But at least it was a bed. And the 3 of us slept in one big double bed for a couple of months until my mother found a job. And then we moved to Hell's Kitchen.
Wow. And how long was the trip? How long was the voyage?
Well, it was supposed to be a week and a half, but it was 3 weeks. Because we got blown off course, and we got lost a little bit until they recalibrated. And it was a rough voyage. It was, yeah. I cannot, till this day, go into a supermarket and smell oranges that are starting to go bad. I lose it right away, because they used to give us oranges and lemons and stack them up in the corner, and it was after about a week they'd all go bad, and they wouldn't take them away. So now you had the smell of oranges gone bad. You know, the penicillin smell, that green orange. And it made us even sicker. You know, nobody came down there. It was terrible. It was
Yeah, you know,
absolutely
you wouldn't think that in the
54,
1950. Yeah, I mean,
1950.
you knew, like when my grandparents came in 1915, you were like, okay, it was 1915, yeah, but 54, that's
54, and it was the last ship. It was the last trip that ship took with passengers. From that point on, it was condemned. Well, they had 2 dead bodies that nobody knew about on board. I have a feeling that created a problem.
probably, yeah. I would think so.
Yeah, my brother and I have adventure stories, and I'm documenting, I'm writing them down because they're so good. And we talk together once a week on Zoom, my brother Michael and I, my older brother, and we recollect, and did this happen? Yeah, that's what happened. Or did that happen? We double check each other, because memory's a tricky thing. You can start telling a story, and when you repeat it, you may tweak it, and now it's not the truth anymore. So I always want to be sure I'm saying the accurate truth as best as I can with him, because he's very pedantic. I'm more of a fantasy person, and he says, no, that's not what happened. So we you know, we're a good balance.
Yeah, and you know, and I'm working with a guy now he's got tapes of people. Anthony worked in the North End of Boston for I don't know 5 or 6 years or something like that when he was young, in the late 70s, and he tape recorded Italian immigrants and have all their stories. And you know, I've listened to a couple so far, and it's amazing. Now these are people who were born in 1904, so you can imagine. And
the early immigrants.
Yeah, and you know, the stories are just fascinating. So we're going to do a little series on that, where he still has all these recordings, so you'll be able to hear these people in their own voices talk about the trip, talk about coming to America. I mean, it's much like we're doing, but you know, imagine that 40, 50 years ago.
Well, the experience I have talked to other immigrants that were older than me who came on the earlier trips. My experience is very similar to theirs because of I don't even know what the word is. First of all, my mother couldn't afford to buy good tickets, so she had to buy steerage. And 3 of us slept in 2 bunk beds on the bottom. And so it's head, foot, you know, the 3 of us. And the people who were above us in the bunk bed were always sick. So, yeah. So I had to save newspapers. I had to hug newspapers. It was the gold exchange, because when you have a newspaper, you can walk, and you can put the newspapers down on the floor and walk. Otherwise, you're walking on a sea of, yeah. Yeah,
Wow.
it was, I will never forget it. And as a result, my poor brother has a terrible gag reflex. I went the other way. I developed an immunity to it so that I could be a nurse, because there's something that happens in your brain when you shut it down, you know, and I'm able to take care of people no matter what the body problems are. It turned out to be a blessing in a way, because my kids were always sick. So yeah. I also wound up being a single parent, by the way. My husband left when I was pregnant with my 2nd child. So just like my mother and my grandmother, the 3 of us wound up raising our kids on our own. Interestingly.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, this has been certainly a lot of fun and fascinating stories. I love them all. And you know, if your brother wants to talk about facts and figures,
He may want to. I told him, I said, you know, he wasn't ready to do it now, but he wanted me to have the experience first. And if the water's right, he'll jump in. So I'll let him know. If you want an explanation on any of the pictures, just let me know, and I can send you a blip on each of the images.
okay, that sounds good.
Okay.
All right, well, thanks again. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. I'm interested in what you had to say as well. Fascinating.